Invincible is, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the strongest characters in his universe. Yet, it doesn't feel like it, despite him now beating the second strongest Viltrumite conquest in the latest season and destroying an entire planet. Because even though on a good day he can beat the strongest characters, on a bad day, D-tier villains like Doc Seismic, the Mauler twins, or the Flaxons can give him a run for his money. One moment he's bench pressing an entire iceberg, and the next he struggles to lift a warship, even with help. The reason most commonly used to justify these power scaling inconsistencies is OT's holding back, which is true to an extent, but when people start using this as an excuse for him losing literally every fight, it feels more like a cop-out for bad writing than a justified explanation. But it does raise an interesting question. How strong would Mark be if he never held back? Today we're going to answer that question, but first, let's look at why he does this in the first place. Throughout the entire series, there's one thing that constantly holds Mark Grayson back, and surprisingly, it's not his lack of experience, his age, or even the enemies he fights. It's himself, his feelings, his fear of losing his humanity, and turning into the very force of evil he is trying so desperately to stop. There was an entire season where his character arc was not turning into his dad, not giving in to his Viltrumite side. From the very beginning, Mark has been pulling his punches. He doesn't want to kill. He doesn't want innocent people getting hurt. And unlike most Viltrumites, he constantly worries about the consequences of his actions. But just how strong would he be if he stopped holding back completely? What if the Earth's greatest defender stopped pulling his punches? Let's go over every major loss of Mark Grayson and see how the outcome would change if he didn't hold back. Mark's first major battle came against the Flaxon army. To be fair, it was his second day, so the lack of coordination seemed quite natural for a teenager with no experience. But what is also painfully obvious is that he was holding back. Being his first actual outing as an independent superhero, Mark soon realizes that it's not all sunshine and roses and comes face to face with the dual nature of superheroing. Even if Mark didn't hold back, it's completely possible that he still remains relatively useless most of this fight, as even in the main timeline, he was only really able to contribute during the second Flaxon invasion. But even with his complete and utter lack of experience combined with his naivety, Mark would definitely get some good hits in if he wasn't worried about hurting anybody. Of course, he would have still gotten absolutely slimed if Omni-Man or Teen Team didn't come. Next up, we have Mark's fight with the myth, the legend, the one and only intergalactic Mufasa, Battle Beast. As a kind of being the mid-season finale, the episode with this fight surely delivered, giving us one of the most brutal moments up until that point, and giving Mark a much needed reality check. Not much has to be said for this fight since it's pretty clear that halfway through, when his adrenaline rush hits, he stops holding back. And he was doing well for a while until Battle Beast decided to get his hands dirty. To be fair, Mark was dealing nicely with the goons Machine Head hired, but he was no match for Battle Beast. Keep in mind, Battle Beast has fought Thrag and given him a run for his money. In no universe, under no circumstances, does Mark win that fight at that point in the story, no matter how much adrenaline he gets or how much he stops holding back. This is one where the power scaling made perfect sense, and Mark holding back wasn't the real issue. Moving on to Mark versus the Reanimen, it is clear here that Mark was holding back quite a bit, since even if the Reanimen used hard metal for their armor, we have seen how easily Mark is able to punch through them in combat. The only fathomable explanation is that Mark was holding back in an attempt to save the living cyborgs, considering the amount of suffering he was put through just a few days later at the hands of his own father. Mark could have easily ended this fight whenever he wanted if he had used his powers fully and hadn't held back. So the new Mark takes the win easily. It's not even close. One can argue that Omni-Man was also having trouble dealing with the Reanimen, but that's not really true. His expressions make it clear that he was just caught off guard by the Reanimen, but not overwhelmed by them. He struggled against the cyborgs for a few seconds before one-shotting them brutally is quite a stupid argument, and Mark could have done the same if he showed less restraint. Next up is the emotional peak of the season, Mark's fight with his father. Afim, calling this a fight doesn't even feel remotely right, since this was mostly a giant lesson for Mark entering adulthood. Mark was clearly holding back in this fight, since he had an emotional bond with his father, but even if he hadn't held back, there is zero chance that he actually beats his father at that point. Not holding back wouldn't even make a slight difference. All it would do is end up in more collateral damage and more casualties. People often forget how enormous the gap was here. Nolan wasn't winning, he was teaching a lesson. Nolan was superior in literally every category. Mark could have fought with pure rage and killer instinct, and the result for him would be the same. If anything, holding back this time saved his life and the lives of countless civilians in the city. If Mark put up more of a fight or seemed more defiant, Nolan could have beaten him to death completely instead of just beating him to the brink of death before leaving him in that crater. Mark holding back here kept him alive. Next is the fight with the Mahler twins in season 2. Mark was holding his own quite well until he inevitably got overwhelmed by the Mahler's numbers. If Mark hadn't held back, he would win this fight. It would probably be close since Mark wasn't as strong as he is now, but Mark would be able to win it. The Mahlers are impressive, but against a Viltrumite who is standing in their full strength, they are quite literally child's play. Oliver was able to take them out, so you know Mark could have made light work of them. If he wasn't concerned with the consequences of killing, they just aren't a match for him. Moving on to the fight on Thraxa. This is kind of a mixed bag, since we do actually see Mark stop holding back, and once he locks in, he is actually able to hold his own against Thula, who was one of the older Viltrumites. But he was immobilized by one finger of Lucan, and if it weren't for Omni-Man, he surely would have lost that fight, as well as the lives of both Oliver and Andressa. Mark does okay against Lucan, but he doesn't win the fight. Lucan and Vidor are still miles ahead of Mark in terms of strength and speed. This is another case where the power gap was simply too large. Could he injure one of them more severely? Probably. Could he win? Not a chance. The outcome in this fight still remains the same whether he holds back or not. Next up is Mark's first confrontation with Anissa. Mark was in fact holding back in this fight. However, even if he wasn't, it's not like much would have changed even if he wasn't pulling his punches. We have some actual proof for it as well, since later on in the series, when Mark is dozens of times stronger than he was during this battle, Anissa still overpowers him. By no stretch of the imagination does Mark win this fight. Even the GDA gives him a less than an 18% chance of surviving a combat encounter with her. An 18% chance of surviving, not even winning. She is stronger, more experienced, and far more ruthless. Luckily for him, she was more of a diplomat than a brute. If it wasn't for that, Mark would have died. In the end, the one holding back here wasn't Mark, it was Anissa. This is where things get interesting. Angstrom Levy is arguably the first villain who only survives because Mark hesitates. Throughout the fight, Mark is trying to stop him without completely losing control. But the second Mark finally snaps, the entire battle changes. Angstrom goes from being a dangerous threat to a helpless victim almost instantly. Mark beats him so badly that he genuinely believes he killed him. If Mark had entered that fight without any restraint whatsoever, Angstrom probably never would have made it past their first encounter. Of course, there would be no escape, no recovery, and no future revenge. Would the outcome change? Absolutely, this is not even up for debate. The only chance Angstrom Levy might have had was if he could trap him in another dimension, but his ego, thirst for revenge, and overconfidence wouldn't have allowed him to make optimal decisions. Blinded by rage, Angstrom loses this fight before it even starts, but Mark's restraint draws it out longer. It gave Levy time to hurt so many more people, including Debbie, and Mark could barely forgive himself for that. The point is, if he hadn't held back, Angstrom Levy would have been a smear on the pavement in minutes. Now, going into season 3, Mark goes through his own little mini training arc and comes out of it faster, stronger, and way more durable. But we are mostly told, not shown, since when the time comes to show that strength, Mark, in classic Invincible fashion, gets his ass handed to him by villains whom he shouldn't even have to entertain anymore. The first fight of the season comes against Doc Seismic and his glorified worms. It is said that they were born deep inside the Earth's crust, making them able to withstand high levels of force and pressure. But still, Mark should have been able to do a little more than the weak baby punches he was throwing, meaning once again, he was holding back. Those centipedes wouldn't have stood a chance if Mark hadn't been holding back. Remember, he would help split a planet in half in the next season, so big worms shouldn't be exactly that big of a problem for him. Frankly, a lot of this stems from inconsistent power scaling. Next is his fight with Mr. Liu. Not only does Mark get absolutely violated in this fight, but he also comes off as insanely incompetent. Instead of trying to take the fight away from the prison, he tries to fight him head on, resulting in a lot of collateral damage. The feats we see him do just a few episodes later make me think that he was holding back quite a bit. To be fair, it is made clear that Mr. Liu's powers come from beyond this dimension, so we don't have an actual frame of reference to base this fight on, but just a few months months later, Mark disrespectfully defeats him in their second fight. Honestly, this should be a closer fight than most think. The outcome of this fight would probably remain the same since the Order was getting attacked from multiple fronts, and the cause of Mark's defeat would still be Machine Head. If it was an all-out brawl with Mark at full force, I think Mr. Liu would still win. Not because Mark is weak, but because he can be worn down. Be worn. His full power would have been welcomed and his best bet, but my money is still on the dragon here. Next is his fight with Powerplex, and this isn't even close. We saw that Mohawk Mark was able to beat Powerplex with just one good hit, and the Mark from the main timeline was able to one-shot Mohawk Invincible once he decided to lock in. Mark would 100% kick his ass, but a combination of pity and guilt held him back. Powerplex was incredibly dangerous and unstable, so letting him live was a profound display of mercy, even if it was a stupid choice. The Invincible War is one of the few events that, contrary to many's expectations, doesn't change dramatically if Mark never holds back. During this storyline, Mark has to deal with multiple alternate versions of himself, many of whom are completely willing to kill anyone, and especially him. One of his biggest weaknesses here is that he still tries to save people while fighting. Shiesty Mark, or Hooded Invincible, also vocalized this, saying, if Mark wasn't trying to protect the ones around him, he could have ended the fight much earlier. A ruthless Mark would focus entirely on eliminating threats as quickly as possible. Several alternate Invincibles likely die much earlier with Mark's full force and attention, reducing the overall destruction. Earth still suffers massive damage because of the sheer number of enemies involved, but Mark would undoubtedly perform much better. Would the outcome change? Partially, since halfway through, Mark decides to park his ass in the hospital and stay with Eve as she heals instead of trying to save the planet. Eliminate that distraction and his concern for the civilians, crank up his hits to be full force, and the Invincible War becomes more of a whisper. Moving on to one of the most brutal fights in the entire show, we have Mark vs. Conquest Round 1. If there's one fight that proves Mark's compassion can be a weakness, it's his first battle against Conquest. Throughout the entire encounter, Conquest constantly exploits Mark's heroism. He attacks civilians, threatens innocent people, and forces Mark to divide his attention. Mark spends a huge portion of the battle trying to protect others instead of focusing entirely on defeating his opponent. If Mark fought as Conquest does, without distractions, without mercy, and without concern for collateral damage, the fight would likely end much sooner. He still takes horrific damage because Conquest is the second strongest Viltrumite, and the power gap between them is massive, but he probably wins faster since Conquest wanted nothing more than a good fight and was holding back himself for most of the encounter. Despite saying from the start that he wouldn't be pulling his punches, Mark was still subconsciously holding back, trying to save others. Once Adam Eve gets hurt, pushing Mark over the edge and giving him nothing to lose, he is able to perform extremely well. And even before Eve gives Conquest the attack on Titan treatment, Mark was able to put in some work. Thankfully, by the end, Mark does learn to use his head, literally. Season 4 is where things really take a turn since the last season ended with the promise of a ruthless Mark Grayson, who wouldn't hesitate to put down the ones who put his family in danger. In many of the fights in previous seasons, Mark was able to turn the tables not because he got a lot stronger, but instead simply because he stopped holding back, showing just how much Mark was holding back to begin with. The emotional element is what brings out his full potential in most of those close fights, but he's reaching a point where that isn't necessary anymore as this season kicks off. It's no more Mr. Nice Mark, and it shows. First, let's talk about the grossest fight in the show, Mark's rematch with Conquest. RIP to the ones enjoying spaghetti while watching this episode. The reason this fight is interesting is that Mark was not holding back in the slightest. He had already seen what Conquest was capable of, thus he wanted the psycho dead more than he wanted to live himself. His will is put on full display here, as despite getting a hole punched through him, Mark is able to choke out Conquest. He had to stay in a coma for a couple months to recover before rejoining the Viltrumite War, but the results speak for themselves here. No restraint. Mark is a menace and nothing to scoff at. Period. Finally, we reach Thrag, the strongest Viltrumite in existence, the ruler of the Empire, the final benchmark for every powerful character in the series. This is where the entire holding back argument becomes irrelevant. At various points in the story, Thrag is simply stronger than Mark. It doesn't matter how angry Mark gets or how ruthless he becomes, raw power and strength still matter. Could an unrestrained Mark perform better against Thrag? Absolutely. Could he push Thrag harder? Definitely, but there are several stages of the story where even an enraged Mark still loses because the gap in power is simply too large. Thrag is one of the few characters who proves that determination alone isn't enough. To make matters worse, the show decided decided to make him even stronger than the comics, basically giving him airbending abilities. Like, even when Mark gets exponentially stronger and doesn't hold back, he still loses to Thrag. The only reason he manages to defeat him later on is a superior battle strategy and a lot of help from his allies, not sheer strength. Due to this, not holding back wouldn't have made a difference against Thrag. Mark is lucky to be alive after their first couple encounters. He's alive because Thrag wants him alive, not because he gave it his all. His all isn't enough to stop Thrag just yet. When you look at all of Mark's biggest losses, a clear pattern starts to emerge. Early in the story, Mark isn't losing because he's holding back. He's losing because he's weaker. Battle Beast, Omni-Man, the Viltrumites on Thraxa, and Anissa would have beaten him regardless of his mindset. But later in the series, once Mark reaches the highest tiers of power, his compassion starts becoming a genuine handicap. Against enemies like Angstrom Levy, Powerplex, Conquest, and the evil Invincibles, holding back becomes the only thing standing between victory and absolute domination. And that's what makes the idea of an unrestrained Mark so terrifying. The strongest version of Invincible isn't necessarily the strongest physically, it's the version that stops caring about mercy altogether. If you made it this far and enjoyed the video, leave a like and subscribe because we have plenty more Invincible breakdowns for you to check out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.